In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit, not a dark, damp hole filled with worms and the smell of rot. No, this was a hobbit hole, and that meant comfort. The round green door opened into a home of warm light, fine food, and peace. Shelves of polished plates, maps of lands he'd never see, and the smell of pipeweed floating gently through the air. Bilbo Baggins loved his quiet mornings. He loved his tea steaming in the sunlight, the hum of bees outside the window, the rustle of the party tree on the hill. Life was simple, predictable, safe. And that, he thought, was quite enough. But fate rarely asks for permission before it knocks. On a perfectly ordinary morning, as Bilbo puffed on his pipe, there came a soft tap at the door. He frowned. Visitors were not common in Hobbiton, and certainly not at that hour. He opened the door, and there stood a tall gray figure with a staff, his eyes gleaming beneath a brimmed hat. "Good morning," said Bilbo cautiously. "What do you mean?" asked the stranger, leaning on his staff with a half-smile. "Do you wish me a good morning, or do you mean that it is a good morning whether I want it or not? Or perhaps you mean that you feel good on this particular morning, or that it is a morning to be good on?" Bilbo blinked. "All of them at once, I suppose." The old man chuckled, his beard twitching. "Then I'll say this. I am Gandalf, and Gandalf means me." At the name, something stirred deep in Bilbo's memory. Whispers of fireworks that turned the night sky into blooming flowers, stories of dragons and heroes told beside his father's hearth. "You're not the Gandalf who used to make such fireworks at Old Took's midsummer parties?" "The very same," said the wizard, his eyes crinkling. "And now I am looking for someone to share an adventure." "An adventure?" Bilbo nearly choked. "Good heavens, no. We don't want any adventures here. Nasty, disturbing, uncomfortable things. Make you late for dinner." He closed the door firmly. But something about that word, adventure, lingered in his chest, like the echo of a bell he wasn't ready to hear. That evening the knock came again, then another, then another. When Bilbo opened the door, a dwarf in a blue hood pushed past him, followed by another and another, until 13 dwarves crowded his round little home, clattering plates, singing songs of mountains and gold, filling his cozy world with noise and purpose. And last of all came Gandalf. "Let's get to business," the wizard said, unrolling a map upon the table. At its center, marked in red ink, was a mountain, the Lonely Mountain. Thorin Oakenshield, proud and stern, stood at the head of the company, his dark hair framed eyes that burned with pride and loss. "Smaug," Thorin said, voice heavy as stone, "the dragon who took our kingdom beneath the mountain, our gold, our home, we mean to reclaim it." The fire crackled, the room fell quiet. Bilbo looked around at them, warriors, wanderers, dreamers, and felt something deep and old awaken inside him. The Tookish part of him, the one that whispered of maps and open skies. "We'll need a burglar," said Gandalf casually. "Someone quiet and cunning, someone unsuspected." Thorin's gaze narrowed. "You mean him?" Gandalf nodded. "Mr. Baggins, he's more than he seems." Bilbo sputtered. "Me? A burglar? I beg your pardon, but I am a respectable hobbit." But it was too late. The contract was written, his name inked, and before he quite knew what he was doing, Bilbo Baggins was packing his pipe and stepping into the morning mist, leaving Bag End behind. They journeyed east through rolling hills and empty roads. The Shire faded behind them like a dream. At first, Bilbo tried to keep up the cheer, whistling, counting steps, wondering when second breakfast would be. But the days grew longer, the paths rougher, and the nights colder. The world outside the Shire was larger than he'd ever imagined, and far more dangerous. By the time they reached the wild lands beyond the river, he was already homesick. One night, as they camped in the dark woods, Bilbo whispered, "I wish I was back home in my armchair." Gandalf, sitting by the fire, looked at him with gentle eyes. "And so do all who live to see such times. But the world is not in our books and maps, my dear Bilbo. It is out there." The Hobbit said nothing, but something in him shifted. The rain came down in sheets. They stumbled upon 3 trolls around a fire, roasting mutton and arguing in thick, grumbling voices. Bilbo, trying to prove his worth, crept closer, only to be caught by one of them, hoisted upside down by his ankles. Now, what's this, a little rabbit?" "Don't eat me," Bilbo squeaked. "I'm a burglar, not breakfast." The trolls laughed, shaking the forest. But before they could decide how best to cook the dwarves, the dawn broke, and Gandalf's voice, mimicking theirs from the shadows, tricked them into quarreling until the sun rose. And in the first light of morning, the trolls turned to stone. Bilbo gasped, heart racing. "You saved us," he whispered. Gandalf smiled. "Perhaps, but you did well enough to get caught at least." From the trolls' cave they found swords, gleaming with ancient runes, one of which Bilbo took, though it felt too heavy for his small hands. "Sting," he murmured, though he didn't yet know why that word felt right. At Rivendell, the last homely house, they were welcomed by elves who sang under starlit arches. Lord Elrond read the moon runes on their map, revealing a secret entrance to the mountain that could be opened only on Durin's Day, when sun and moon shared the same sky. Bilbo listened to the elven songs, watching light dance on the waterfalls. For a moment, he felt something new. Wonder. There was beauty in the world beyond his door, and danger, too. But perhaps they were both needed. Then came the misty mountains. Thunder rolled like drums in the dark, and lightning carved the sky into jagged teeth. The company took shelter in a cave, but in the night the goblins came. Dark hands, red eyes, cruel laughter. They were seized and dragged into the black tunnels of the mountain. Bilbo barely remembered the chaos. Gandalf's flash of light, swords singing in the dark, the dwarves running, his own breath catching as he tumbled down into blackness. He woke alone. The air was cold and damp. The only sound was the drip of water, and there, glinting on the stone beside him, was a small gold ring. He picked it up, turning it in his fingers. Simple, unmarked. A whisper of fate stirred the air. Then he heard it, a strange, wet voice echoing through the dark. "What has it got in its pockets?" Bilbo froze. The voice came closer, and out of the gloom slid a pale creature with eyes like lamps. Gollum! A riddle game began. Words traded like blades, each one a step closer to doom. 30 white horses on a red hill," Bilbo said, his voice trembling. Teeth! Teeth! Hissed Gollum, grinning. Back and forth they went, riddles twisting in the dark, until Bilbo, desperate, clutched the ring and whispered, "What have I got in my pocket?" Gollum's fury rose. He lunged, but the ring slipped on Bilbo's finger, and the world vanished, invisible. Bilbo gasped, staring at his hands gone like smoke. The ring's power hummed against his skin. He crept past Gollum, heart hammering, until he saw daylight and Gandalf's voice calling in the distance. "Bilbo! Bilbo Baggins!" He stumbled out of the mountain, shaking, gasping, clutching the ring in his pocket. No one saw the fear in his eyes. No one knew what he carried. But Bilbo did. Something had changed inside him. He had looked at darkness and survived. The company walked beneath skies of iron and wind. Behind them lay the wild hills and the black mouths of the mountains. Before them, endless valleys rolled like waves into shadow. Bilbo walked quietly now. He didn't chatter as much as he once did. The others noticed it, the way he sometimes stared at his hand when he thought no one was looking, or how he touched his pocket as if to make sure something precious was still there. He had not told them about the ring, not even Gandalf. But in the nights when all else slept, he turned it between his fingers, feeling its strange weight. It whispered of safety, of vanishing when the world pressed too hard. It made him feel powerful, and that frightened him. Still, something else had changed too. Bilbo no longer felt quite so small. When they reached the edge of the dark forest, Gandalf halted his horse. "Mirkwood," he said, his voice low, "do not stray from the path." Bilbo looked into the shadows, trees rising like pillars, their branches locked in a web of black leaves that swallowed the light. The air smelled of rot and secrets. "Where will you be?" Bilbo asked. Gandalf smiled faintly. "I have pressing business elsewhere. You must go on without me for a while." Thorin frowned. "We can't spare you." "Then don't," Gandalf replied. "But you'll manage. Mr. Baggins here seems to have found a spine after all." And with that he was gone, like smoke on the wind. Bilbo stood staring after him, feeling suddenly smaller than ever. They entered Mirkwood, and the light disappeared. Days bled into each other. The air was thick, the path narrow, and the silence broken only by the creak of branches and the hum of unseen things. Their food ran low, their hope even lower. Bilbo lost track of time. Sometimes he thought he heard laughter in the dark, sometimes weeping. Once he dreamed of the Shire, the clink of dishes, the smell of bacon, his mother's garden, and woke with tears on his face. The forest pressed closer each day until even the stars were gone. When the dwarves strayed from the path, chasing lights that looked like feasts in the trees, the company became lost. And then came the spiders, black, glistening, whispering creatures that dropped from the branches like nightmares made flesh. Bilbo fought. He didn't think. He just moved. He slashed with his little sword, its blade glowing faintly blue. He felt the sting of poison, the heat of fear, and then, to his own astonishment, he heard himself shouting, "Get away from them!" The spider hissed. Bilbo's sword flashed again, and when the creature fell twitching, he gasped for air, trembling. He looked down at the blade, sticky with black blood. I'll call you Sting," he whispered, and for the first time he realized he was not the same hobbit who had left Bag End. When the spiders lay dead and the dwarves freed, they stared at him with new eyes. "Mr. Baggins," Thorin said, wiping his brow, "you have earned your place among us." Bilbo blushed. He didn't quite know what to do with praise. Well, it was nothing, really. But inside, he felt something fierce and warm. Not pride, exactly, but courage. Their troubles, however, were not done. Captured by the Wood Elves, they were thrown into the dungeons of the woodland realm. Thorin was separated, and the others despaired. Bilbo, unseen with his ring, wandered the halls in silence, watching the elves feast beneath golden lamps. He saw their beauty, but also their suspicion, their longing for order and peace in a wild world. He pitied them, even as he plotted their escape. Night after night he searched, thinking, planning, and when the time came, he rolled the dwarves into empty barrels and floated them down the rushing river, laughing in disbelief as the cold spray hit his face. He'd done it. He'd saved them. By the time they crawled out near Lake Town, soaked and shivering, the dwarves no longer called him burglar in jest. They called him friend. Lake Town was a place of wooden bridges and sharp voices, people hardened by water and wind. But when Thorin spoke of reclaiming Erebor, their hearts stirred. The songs rose again, songs of gold and kings beneath mountains, of dragons and fire. Bilbo listened, uneasy. He saw the light in Thorin's eyes, the hunger there. It was not only for home, but for power, for gold. He shivered. That night, as the company set out for the lonely mountain, Bilbo whispered to himself, "I wish I could see the Shire again." But the words were softer now, not from fear, but from knowing that the road home would never be the same. The lonely mountain loomed like a scar against the sky. Snow dusted its crown. Shadows filled its wounds. The air itself seemed to tremble with memory of fire, of screams, of wings blotting out the sun. They camped before the secret door, their breath white in the cold air. Days passed. The keyhole remained hidden. Then one evening, as the sun dipped low and the last light of Durin's day struck the stone, a flash of gold revealed the lock. "Quick!" cried Bilbo. The key turned, the door opened, and darkness breathed from the mountain's heart. The dwarves urged him on. "You're our burglar. Go see what's inside." Bilbo swallowed hard. Every instinct told him to run. But he took a deep breath, drew Sting, and stepped into the dark. The tunnel twisted down like the throat of the earth. Heat and the smell of gold filled the air. And then he saw it, a vast chamber, a sea of treasure stretching to the walls, gold coins, jeweled goblets, armor gleaming like the sun, and atop it all lay a dragon, Smaug. His scales shimmered red and gold, his breath rising in slow thunder. Bilbo froze, heart hammering so loud he feared it would wake the beast. He crept forward, invisible with his ring, every step echoing through the cavern. The dragon stirred. "Who dares disturb my slumber?" Bilbo's breath caught. He answered, somehow impossibly, his voice trembling but clever. "I come from under the hill, and under the hill I return." Smaug's great eye opened, molten gold, piercing. thief in the shadows, he hissed. I smell you, but I cannot see you. The dragon's laughter shook the mountain. Bilbo's courage burned and faltered and burned again. He saw the bare patch in Smaug's jeweled armor, the weak spot. He took note, heart pounding. And when the dragon rose, wings unfurling, rage thundering through the halls, Bilbo ran. Smaug roared, You think you can steal from me? I am fire. I am death. The mountain trembled as he tore through the tunnels and soared into the sky. Bilbo stumbled back to the dwarves, gasping, We've awakened him. Far away, fire bloomed on the horizon. Lake Town would burn. When the smoke rose the next day, the world had changed again. Smaug was dead, slain by Bard the bowman, whose arrow found the gap in the dragon's scales. But peace did not follow. Thorin's heart, once noble, now burned with greed. He sealed himself within the mountain, counting gold as armies gathered outside, men and elves demanding their share of Smaug's treasure. Bilbo watched in silence, sorrow stirring in his chest. He remembered the songs, the laughter, the journey that had made them friends. Now he saw only pride and the shadow it cast. At night he slipped away, carrying the Arkenstone, the heart of the mountain shining like captured starlight. He did not take it for himself. He took it to stop the war. The mountain slept uneasily after the dragon's fall. Outside, winter winds swept the valley, carrying with them the cries of crows and the sound of marching feet. Within the halls of Erebor, Thorin sat upon a throne of stone, his eyes glimmering with gold's reflection. Bilbo stood in the shadows, watching him. The dwarf king's fingers clenched the armrest as if afraid it might vanish. The gold seemed to hum around him, whispering promises of power, of legacy. Thorin, Bilbo said softly, the men of the lake have lost their homes. The elves bring food and aid. They seek only what was promised, a share, not war. Thorin's gaze lifted slowly. Promised? He said, voice low, dangerous. What promise have I made to thieves who come crawling to my gate? This gold is ours. Theirs is the ruin they brought upon themselves. Bilbo hesitated. You are not the Thorin I knew on the road. For a heartbeat, something flickered behind the dwarf's eyes. A memory of laughter, of firelight, of the hobbit who once couldn't tell a sword from a walking stick. But it faded. Go, if you wish, Thorin murmured, turning away, but never question the right of kings. Outside, the campfires of men and elves flickered in the cold. Their banners trembled in the wind, white and green for the woodland realm, blue and silver for Lake Town. Bilbo walked between them, his heart heavy, the Arkenstone hidden beneath his cloak. He felt the pulse of it, not of warmth, but of sorrow. It was beautiful, yes, but too bright, too perfect, the kind of beauty that blinds. When Bard the bowman saw him, his eyes narrowed in surprise. The Hobbit? I came to offer you something, Bilbo said, voice steady despite the fear rising in his chest. He drew out the Arkenstone. The light of it spilled across the tents, soft and cold as moonlight. The elves gasped. Bard stepped forward, awe and disbelief written on his face. The heart of the mountain. Bilbo nodded. If this will stop bloodshed, take it. Use it to bargain for peace. The men murmured among themselves, Bard looked at him long and hard. "You would give away your share of the treasure?" Bilbo smiled faintly. "It was never really mine." When Thorin discovered the betrayal, the mountain shook with his fury. He stormed toward Bilbo, sword drawn, his voice echoing through the golden halls. "You have betrayed us!" The dwarves moved between them, torn between loyalty and disbelief. Bilbo stood still. "I gave it away to save you," he said quietly, "to save all of us." Thorin's face twisted, torn between rage and grief. For a moment, Bilbo thought he might strike him. But then Gandalf's voice thundered through the hall. "Enough!" The wizard had returned, and with him reason. Thorin lowered his sword. His hands trembled. "Go, Bilbo Baggins," he said, voice hoarse. "Before I forget I ever called you friend." And so the hobbit left the mountain. He walked alone into the cold night, feeling the weight of every step. The wind howled through the valley, carrying whispers of war. He looked up at the stars. They were sharp and distant, beautiful but indifferent. "Maybe this is how stories end," he whispered to himself. "Not with cheers, but with silence." At dawn, the horns blew. From the north, a black tide poured over the hills, goblins and wargs, their shrieks tearing through the mist. The armies that had come to quarrel turned instead to face a greater enemy. Men, elves, dwarves, all side by side. The battle of the 5 armies had begun. Bilbo did not see much of it. He wore the ring when the fighting grew close, and the world turned to smoke and fear. He saw shadows clash in the fog, heard the cries of the wounded, smelled the iron tang of blood. At one point, he saw Thorin, his friend, his king, charging down from the mountain with his company, golden armor gleaming like a sunrise against the dark. The dwarves roared their war cry, and for a heartbeat, Bilbo felt pride burn through his fear. Then a blow, a sound like the cracking of the world. He fell, darkness rushing up to meet him. When he woke, the sky was gray and heavy with snow. The battle was over. Around him lay the still forms of the fallen. He stumbled through the ruin, calling out names. No answer. Then he saw Gandalf by a tent at the mountain's foot. The wizard's face was weary, older somehow. "Bilbo," he said gently, "Thorin wishes to see you." Inside the tent, Thorin lay pale against his cloak, his breath shallow. The fury was gone from him. Only the man remained, proud, broken, and free. Bilbo knelt beside him, tears stinging his eyes. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. Thorin's hand found his. His voice was faint, but clear. "There was never any need to ask your forgiveness, my friend. You did what I could not." He paused, eyes distant, as if seeing something far beyond the tent. If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. Bilbo bowed his head. "Farewell, Thorin Oakenshield," he whispered. "King under the mountain." The fire dimmed. The wind fell silent. And with it, Thorin's last breath. Afterward, Bilbo walked among the broken earth where the battle had been. The snow fell softly now, covering the scars of war. The crows were gone. The cries had ended. he watched the elves depart, silent as moonlight. He saw Bard, weary but unbowed, guiding his people toward the lake once more, and he thought of home, of the green door, the tea kettle, the smell of morning rain. He said goodbye to Gandalf and to the dwarves who remained. They offered him gold, mountains of it, but he only shook his head. "I think," he said, "that I've had enough of dragons and treasure for one lifetime." And so Bilbo Baggins turned his feet toward the west. The journey home was long and quiet. The roads that had once seemed endless now felt small. The hills of the Shire rose before him like a dream half forgotten. When he reached his round green door, the sun was setting behind it, painting the sky in colors that only existed in memory. He stood there a long while, his pack heavy on his shoulders. The door creaked open. Dust floated in the air. The smell of home wrapped around him like an old blanket. But something had changed. Everything looked smaller, or perhaps he had grown. In the evenings, Bilbo sat by the fire with his pipe, writing in a leather-bound book. The words came slowly at first, then faster, as if the story wanted to live on its own. There and Back Again, by Bilbo Baggins. He wrote about trolls and goblins, about a ring and a dragon, about friends he would never see again. He wrote about courage, the kind that lives quietly, hidden in small hearts until the world calls it forth. Sometimes he would stop and stare at the fire, thinking of Thorin's last words, food, cheer, song. He smiled faintly. A merrier world indeed. And somewhere deep in the Shire, the echoes of that adventure, the laughter, the tears, the thunder of dragon wings, settled into legend. The hobbit who once wished only for tea and quiet mornings had walked into the wild and returned changed, carrying not gold, but wisdom. He was, after all, the most unlikely of heroes, and though his tale had ended, another was already beginning, in a ring lying quietly upon a shelf, glinting in the firelight, waiting for its turn to shape the fate of Middle-earth.